Testing 1, 2, 3. In the last video portion, we studied the microstructure of block 1A involving dynamic progression that moved through the portions of that block. Now we'll turn our attention to closure that operates in the recap concluding block 1A. As you may recall, block 1A spans 2513 through 28, and we've entitled that Self-Control Concerning the Hazard of Greed in 4 Relationships with Recap. The 4 relationships then run from 2513 through 2524. They involve relationships first between subordinate and superior, secondly, relationship from neighbor to neighbor, third, relationship between a person and another who hates him, and fourth, relationship between the courtier and his spouse. That takes us through 2524 and brings us to what we're calling the first cumulative recap, which is in chapter 25, verses 25 to 28. This is the 5th and final unit of block 1A. It brings closure to the preceding 4 units, and it does so in 3 ways. First, let's focus on verses 25 and 26. These comprise a quatrain that coheres through the common theme of refreshment brought by water. Let's go ahead and read those verses. Cool waters over a weary soul, such is a good report from a distant land. Muddied headwaters and a ruined spring, such is a moral person who loses his footing in the presence of a guilty person. Closure operates in these first 2 verses of the recap as the sage revisits the first of 4 relationships. That first one was the relationship existing between the courtier as envoy and the person who dispatched him to fill that role. So we're saying that verses 25 and 6 here are recalling verses 13 through 15. Let's turn back to see those particular verses. Notice the premium that the sage places on an envoy's trustworthiness in verse 13. As snows chill on harvest day, that's refreshing, so is a faithful envoy to his senders. The soul of his master will he revive. Notice this, and then notice the refreshing goodness of an envoy's report that we see in verse 25. Verse 25 in the lower left, cool waters over a weary soul, such as a good report from a distant land. By comparing these 2, we can, I believe, reliably infer that the goodness of the envoy's report here in verse 25, a good report from a distant land, this lies in its truthful candor. That's what qualifies a report as good, not in the extent to which it documents only those developments that are desirable. In other words, a good report is good because it's accurate and reliable, not because it confines itself to news that will make the sender, the boss, the manager, pleased with favorable developments. You can report bad developments, it's still a good report if it's accurate and reliable. In contrast, ruination of these metaphoric waters' potential for refreshment that we see in 25-26, this ruination comes about when a guilty person enters the scene and evidently intimidates that originally honest envoy, perhaps threatening him with harm if he dares to submit a damaging report. In this way, we can imagine that the guilty may cause the envoy to, as the sage puts it, lose his footing. That is, may cause him to drift from the bedrock of integrity in his reporting. Muddied headwaters and a ruined spring, such is a moral person, and I take this to refer to the person dispatched to serve as an envoy, the moral person who loses his footing in the presence of a guilty person, who succumbs to intimidation, perhaps. That guilty person who is intimidating would prefer that the envoy would submit a deceptive report that is strictly favorable, boasting achievements that neither he nor the guilty fellow may ever produce. And that reminds us of verse 14 earlier in this chapter. Mist and wind, but no rain. Such is a person given to boasting about a false gift. This then is the first element of closure operating in the recap. It concentrated on verses 25 and 26, realizing that this notion of presenting a reliable or a deceptive report, that envoy function, the sage had earlier introduced in verses 13 through 16. Second, let's consider verses 27 and 28 here in this recap. Here is a quatrain that coheres through the shared theme of self-control. In 27, excessive consumption of honey betrays an appetite out of control. Let's read that. To eat a large quantity of honey is not good, but to search out their glory is glory. In verse 28, the sage finally labels with complete transparency this theme of self-control that has actually dominated the entire block. And he does so by employing the expression restraint over one's spirit. So verse 28 reads, a city which has been breached has no wall. Such is a person who has no restraint over his spirit. Closure operates in these two verses since the concept of moderated honey consumption, that's verse 27, earlier opened the second of the four courtier relationships, that between neighbors. We want to notice then the mention of honey back in verse 16 that opened up that neighbor section. And when one views the whole of Block 1A through the lens of restraint over one's spirit, which was named in 28, a sense of comprehensive closure comes into sharp focus. Let's see how that happens. To begin with, the envoy must exercise self-restraint to keep in check his desire to present only a favorable report. Envoy must give a faithful report, not strictly a favorable report. If he doesn't exercise restraint over his spirit, he may give in to editing his report to only give positive news, and he must not do so. In addition, that same envoy must exercise self-restraint to overcome his reactive tendency to tell off his supervisor. Refer to verse 15 that talks about self-control in communication towards a supervisor who may be difficult to deal with. What about the second relationship, neighbor to neighbor? The courtier must exercise self-restraint, lest he take indulgent advantage of his neighbor's hospitality. That's verses 16 and 17. Similarly, the neighbor must exercise self-restraint, lest he take treacherous advantage of his neighbor's relative powerlessness. That's verses 18 and 19. And all this is summarized in verse 20. How about the third relationship and self-restraint? The offended courtier must show considerable self-control toward those who hate him, replacing revenge with benevolent care. That requires self-restraint. That was in verses 21 and 2. And finally, the fourth relationship, the marriage relationship and self-restraint. The married courtier must keep in check any inclination to treat his wife roughly, lest he be sentenced to sparse and solitary accommodations. So we see this theme of self-restraint, which becomes crystal clear in the recap, operating with closure, since it actually permeated all those four other relationships. The third way in which closure operates here in the recap to Block 1A, involves the recurrence of the specific words soul, seen in 25A, and the word which may be translated either wind or spirit, ruach. We see it in 28B. Thus, 25A, cool waters over a weary soul. Notice the word soul. 28B, such is a person who has no restraint over his spirit. That's the word that can be rendered either wind or spirit. Within Block 1A, the term soul appears only at the start of its first unit and at the start of this recap, which is its final unit. Notice the start of its first unit. Chapter 25, verse 13, looking at Part B. So is a faithful envoy to his senders, and the soul of his master will he revive. That was the first verse of the block. And now 25:25, cool waters over a weary soul. First verse of the final unit. How about the term rendered either wind or spirit? This frames the first 4 units, units 1 through 4. We'll notice it first in verse 14a. Verse 14, mist and wind, but no rain. And then remaining within the first 4 units, not moving to the recap yet, then the first 4 units, we want to notice verse 23, 25:23. A north wind will give birth to rain. This appears at the beginning of the 4th unit, the one related to marriage. This is what we mean by saying the word wind frames the first 4 units, appearing early in the first unit, not the very first verse, but the second verse, verse 14, and then the opening verse of the 4th unit. Now, apart from these 2 framing uses, from unit 1 through 4, the term wind or spirit within Block 1A only occurs as the final word of the final unit. And now notice 25, verse 28. A city which has been breached has no wall, such as a person who has no restraint over his spirit. And that's what we mean by saying that usage of the word spirit or wind here in the recap, in fact, the very last word of the recap, the end of 25:28, should not be viewed in isolation, but we should remind ourselves when earlier within this block we saw wind or spirit in use, and appreciate that the use at the end is cashing in on that earlier usage, creating a sense of closure. It's instructive to notice that the first 2 references to wind, verse 14, mist and wind but no rain, that's negative. That is pretentiousness. That is the hope of rain, but it's not delivered. It's not carried in on this wind. Second use of wind in verse 23, a north wind will bring birth to rain. This also is negative. And now when we come to wind or spirit, at the end of verse 28, the sage is saying, you've got a spirit and you need to keep it under control. That's as if saying you must not let it run away with you, as wind in verse 14, that is pretentious and false, deceptive. You must not let it run away like the north wind and abuse your spouse. You must keep your wind, your spirit, under control. As we continue our study of the microstructural features in section 1, that is 25:13 through 27 verse 4, we continue next to overlapping palistrophes that span the first unit of Block 1B. Block 1B begins in chapter 26 verse 1. You can see in the heading on the lower left that it continues through 27 verse 4, We're suggesting the title Shrewdness concerning the hazard of generosity. That contrasts self-control concerning the hazard of greed in the previous block. So shrewdness concerning the hazard of generosity in 3 relationships with recap. We're concentrating here on the first unit of this block, which you see on the bottom of the left side, unit B1. That's entitled The Patently Stupid, 26:1 through 12. There are 2 features that create coherence within this unit, unit 1B1. First, the sage refers to the stupid person by that term in each of its 12 verses, with the exception of verse 2. So by sheer repetition, a formal device, we find a high degree of coherence in these 12 verses. The second feature creating coherence, then, is the one we're targeting on at this point, and that has to do with what is arguably the most artful structure to be found within the entire book of Proverbs, namely a single poem consisting of a pair of palistrophes. These are not simply adjacent, where one extends, stops, and another one begins, but these 2 palistrophes actually overlap. Notice here these 2 tables that help portray the overlapping palistrophes. The first palistrophe recycles in verses 5 through 8 in reverse order 4 elements that first appeared in 1 through 4. So we begin verses 1, 2, 3, and 4 unaware that it's a palistrophe until we come to verse 5. And you might recall this fairly obvious hinge point. Verse 4 says, "Do not answer a stupid person, such and such." And then verse 5 turns around and provides the opposite counsel, quite paradoxically. "Do answer a stupid person in such and such a manner." At that point, the palistrophe is hinging so that 5 mirrors 4. Then we come to verse 6. Notice the heading, "Suffering of bodily harm," particularly leg amputation and poisoning. This echoes verse 3, "Suffering of bodily harm," namely with elements of a whip, a bridle, and beating. Continuing on, verse 7, "Immobile communication," that is, communication that doesn't function well, namely a proverb in the mouth of stupid folk. Why do we call it immobile communication? Here, verse 7, "Thighs were dangling on account of lameness," that's immobility, "and a proverb was in the mouth of stupid folk." The idea there is he's got the equipment, but it doesn't work. He's got the proverb, he doesn't know how to use it. Or in the picture of someone who's disabled, they have legs, but they don't work. That's how he describes a fool who has wisdom, but doesn't know how to use it. This mirrors verse 2, which we're calling aimless communication. A curse that will not come to pass. It's communication, but it's aimless. It does not land. Here's how verse 2 reads, "As the bird is disposed to flutter, and the swallow is disposed to fly, so a groundless curse cannot alight." He's describing these animals that keep hovering around but are hesitant to land. He says a curse that is not deserved, it is groundless or baseless, it will not alight, it will not stop and produce the negative effects that the person issuing the curse hoped it would. That brings us to verse 8, where we find the word glory in line terminal position, which as you see mirrors verse 1, which also employs the word glory in line terminal position. Notice verse 8. "As binding a stone into a slingshot, so is one who gives glory to a stupid person." When we see how that's expressed in the Hebrew, we find that the last word of verse 8 is glory. So is one who gives to a stupid person glory. That's the actual Hebrew word order. And as we look at 26 verse 1, the palistrophically mirroring piece, glory is the last word. The second hemistich of 26:1 reads, thus not suitable for a stupid person, is glory. Next, please turn your attention to what we're calling the second palistrophe. This one begins in verse 4, which we've already treated, and continues on, though, through verse 12 of chapter 26. Within this second palistrophe, the palistrophically tracking element of verse 4 is not the expression, do not answer a stupid person. You see, that was the tag expression in the first palistrophe that tipped us off to the recurrence of it in verse 5. We're not going to pay attention to that. Rather, we're paying attention this second round within verse 4 to the expression, his folly. So verse 4 reads, do not reply to a stupid fellow in a manner corresponding to his folly. This links with the expression, his folly, in verse 11. We see it there at the end. For as a dog returns to its vomit, a stupid person repeats his folly. Admittedly, the expression his folly also occurs in verse 5. That usage served, I believe, to render transparent the pivot link within verse 4 that was part of the longer expression, do not reply to a stupid fellow in a manner corresponding to his folly. When we come, again, looking at the second overlapping palistrophe, and we move from verse 4 to verse 5, the element in verse 5 that will reappear later within the second palistrophe consists of the expression, wise in his own estimation. So verse 5, reply to a stupid fellow in a manner corresponding to his folly, lest he become wise in his own estimation. This parallels something we see in verse 12. Verse 12 reads, you have seen no doubt a person who is wise in his own estimation. So in this expression, verse 5 and verse 12 recycles a piece from verse 5. Within the second palistrophe, the remaining elements consist of the same elements as were already identified in the first palistrophe. Here's what we mean by that. The component involving ineffective communication that we've already seen in the first palistrophe, showing up in verse 2, aimless communication, verse 7, immobile communication. Now we can add to that verse 9. So in the lower chart, you see that verse 7 is on the same indentation level as verse 9. Verse 7, immobile communication, a proverb in the mouth of stupid folk. And in verse 9, hazardous communication, a proverb in the mouth of stupid folk. Let's see how verse 9 reads. A briar has come into the hand of a drunkard, and a proverb into the mouth of stupid folk. Verse 7, thighs were dangling on account of lameness, and a proverb was in the mouth of stupid folk. Exceptionally redundant. And I'm persuaded that the sage is not doing that simply out of boredom or lack of creativity. He's doing that to make crystal clear, to get our attention and say, I'm repeating these words on purpose. There's a pattern to this. I hope you notice it. And then the component involving suffering of bodily harm, which we saw earlier, verses 3 and 6. Notice the summary heading given for 3, suffering of bodily harm. The elements there are a whip, a bridle, and a beating. That corresponded to verse 6, suffering of bodily harm, leg amputation, and poisoning. That same heading is brought down then in the second overlapping palistrophe for verse 6, and we see that verse 10 runs at the same level of subordination and is headed, suffering of bodily harm, an archer who wounds everyone. Let's read that. Verse 10, an archer who wounds everyone, such as one who hires a stupid fellow and one who hires transients. Within the second overlapping palistrophe, it's worth pointing out that verses 4 and 5 operate like a quatrain. In similar fashion, 11 and 12 link together as a quatrain. What we're trying to point out here is that 4 does not in isolation correspond to 12 as outermost parts of a palistrophe. 5 does not in isolation correspond to 11 as the next stage in of subordination, but rather 4 and 5 together correspond to 11 and 12 together. Thus, the element consisting of 11 and 12 mirrors 4 plus 5 as a whole, rather than linking its individual component verses in chiastic inversion. The fact that here in this second palistrophe, that is the overlapping portion running 4 through 12, the fact that this casts 4 plus 5 as a quatrain rather than as 2 isolated verses means that when one first encounters the phrase wise in his own estimation at the end of verse 5, it's enjoying a prominence of position as a quatrain ending phrase. It's not ending just verse 5, but it's ending the whole quatrain, a heavier, a bulkier portion, 4 plus 5. Its prominence, that is, the prominence of the expression wise in his own eyes, grows even more transparent when it recurs at the entire poem's close, that is, the close of the poem starting in 26:1, running through 12. 12 reads, "You have seen, no doubt, a person who is wise in his own estimation. A stupid person has more hope than he." So there it shows up within verse 12, the last verse. It is not at the end of the verse, but it is definitely within the last verse of this 12-verse poem. The fact that it occurs terminally here, at the end of the quatrain 4 plus 5, and at the last verse, verse 12, this terminal usage will help to signal the close of the next brief teaching concerning the next character, who will be the lazy fellow. Why is that? Let's take a look at verse 16 and watch for the expression wise in his own estimation. On the left side of the screen, you see the stupid fellow. That portion concludes at 26:12. Then the next character begins in 26:13. You see the heading, the incurably lazy, which is Unit 2, spanning 13 to 16. And what we're inviting you to do then is look at verse 16 and notice that in this last verse of the portion describing the incurably lazy, that is the last verse of 13 through 16, we encounter none other than this expression, wise in his own estimation. So it was at the end of 5. It was the end of that poem in verse 12. Consequently, when we encounter it in 16, we should not be surprised to discover that it ends that short little 4-verse poem concerning the lazy person, which reads, verse 16, "In his own estimation, the lazy fellow is wiser than 7 who respond with sound discernment." This wraps up our study of the palistrophe operating in Block 1B. In the next video portion, we'll continue with microstructures that operate in Section 1.